Thank you, Alyssa and Maya. That was fantastic. Maya, I can tell you, you're not the only one on this call who has at moment lost motivation. This has been a hard run for all of us, but thank you both. And we're going to turn to the third category of findings, although I just want to say back on the online learning, most of the young people feel like their teachers are trying. It's better when it's synchronous than asynchronous. But these are young people like young people across the city who are living often in multi-generational households. And I'd say particularly the daughters, but also in some cases the sons are picking up a lot of family responsibility. When the bodega closes or dad's business closes or mom's business closes or mom has to take on two extra jobs as a home health care worker, daughters and sons are picking up the labor. So they're on Zoom with their little brothers and sisters in kindergarten or third grade, plus trying to do their own work. And so we see when the kind of state shrinks and burdens increase, it's often adolescents in families without a lot of extra resources, adolescents who are picking up both the psychological labor and the physical labor, and sometimes their academic work takes a hit. So we're going to go to the third area of findings. In the midst of the pandemic, the youth researchers were very committed that we ask that they ask each other about their reactions to the protests and the uprisings. So Sam Feinser is a professor at Gutman Community College. He's been working with two young people analyzing those data. Sam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Samuel Feinser. I'm an adjunct at Gutman, and along with some of my students from Gutman, initially 2 years ago, we came in and we sort of train these young folks in how to conduct oral histories. Since then, they have become experts themselves, conducting, I think, 97 oral histories of their peers. And so I'm going to leave it to Alondra and Aidan, who have sort of become experts, not just in their own activisms of what's going on with young folks in this moment, but also as researchers who have talked to their peers and studied what's going on. So I turn it over to you, Alondra.
Okay, so I'm not Alondra, I'm Aidan.
Sorry, Aidan, apologies.
And Sam brought me here to talk about culturally responsive education. So yeah. Most social studies classes through American history have had the same traditionalist perspective. Historically, this was very common in middle and high schools throughout the nation, and whitewashed history taught through the lens of white men is still present in some schools today. However, S2 was not one of those schools. Led by our history teacher, Ms. Pfeiffer, the students of S2 had an awakening experience. This curriculum has changed many of our lives, including my own. Going into 2020 in high school, we were prepared to deal with the problems that arose around us. From the interviews conducted by the S2 Research Collective, it became clear that culturally responsive classes, particularly in history courses, prepared students to engage in conversations about systemic racism sparked after the murder of George Floyd. One of our students from these interviews stated, in social study classes, that class was amazing. They taught us so many things. It was really one of the main classes that taught us about the real world. And we just learned a lot about racism, discrimination, police brutality. We learned a lot about that in S2. Not only did these conversations prepare us to think critically about race relations in US history, but they empowered us to deploy that knowledge to engage in conversations about racial injustice taking place all around us. Another student recalled, not only did Ms. Pfeiffer teach me about history and like important things that happened, she also taught me how to talk about them, how to think about them. Students that didn't have culturally responsive educations were heard as popular discourses in the US began to confront the nation's historical and current racial injustices. One more student said, I know some schools remain silent. I think that's very wrong, especially as kids or teenagers and children growing up, especially in high school. In New York, you see a lot of things around you and things like the wrong approach because people are learning about it. It's better to be open with your students. And these are all quotes from our research that we've conducted. And I'll hand it off to Alondra.
So since the murder of George Floyd, at protests and over social media, conversations have sparked between youth. Our education at S2 prepared us not only to become leaders, but also active listeners for this moment. I personally learned how to have conversations with peers in persuasive ways using historical context that I learned in large part from my experience at S2. From my work in the S2 Research Collective, I now know I was not alone. A student stated, I feel like most of my friends and some of my family went on Instagram and they posted a lot of information on Black Lives Matter. On their bios, they would put the George Floyd GoFundMe. They donated to the family and they would post like the black screen with the caption Black Lives Matter. It wasn't just that we learned the historical context of racism in America, but we also learned how to engage with other people's experiences in a serious, respectful, and proactive manner. A student stated, my mother took me to a protest in New York. When you hear people speak about their past experiences, it's very awakening. I feel this whole movement generally has really shown how prevalent racism is in our country. It wasn't just conversation with peers that youth interviewed for this project spoke of, but also very often difficult conversation with family members who did not see their own liberation tied to the liberation of others. A student said, well, the people in our country originated from Africa. And I see that as Dominicans, they're only Black when it's needed. Like, they're only Black when they want to say the N-word. I'm like, look at these protests, like, support something, say something. She continues within her family. My family don't consider themselves people of color, like being Dominican. They're like, I'm Spanish. Like, what are you saying? Because we received the culturally responsive education denied to our parents and grandparents, many of whom immigrated to this country, some tough conversations were also taking place within households. I'm going to pass it over to Aiden because now we're going to talk about over-policing.
Yeah, so as conversations about racial justice had risen in the consciousness of our peers and family members, our generation, especially those lucky enough to receive a culturally responsive education, is increasingly gazing critically at the ways we experience structural racism in our everyday lives, particularly when it comes to encounters with law enforcement. Our research has shown neighborhoods and schools predominantly of color have been disproportionately over-policed compared to predominantly white areas. Some of our students gave the following statements regarding this subject. There's over-policing in brown communities and Black communities, and I do see that. I don't have that much trust in police just because of experiences from other people. Another student said, I honestly do not like police, and when I see police, I feel scared. I feel scared because you never know what could happen, what they could do. I also realize that there's also good police. I cannot say all police are bad. And finally, one other student said, I want there to be more justice. The police have way too much power. I just feel like the city needs to open their eyes and fix it for the better.
Over-policing does not only happen in our neighborhoods, but it also happens in our schools. As a student at the Facing History School, every morning before class, I would pass through metal detectors. Having prior knowledge of school segregation, over-policing in schools, and the school-to-prison pipeline, I knew why my school had metal detectors and why some other public schools did not. My school has a predominantly Black and brown student body who are of low income. I saw how Beacon High School, which is another public school a few blocks away from mine, did not have metal detectors. Beacon High School has a predominantly white student body. Both my campus and Beacon's campus have about the same amount of students. If one public school has metal detectors, all public schools should. According to people in positions of power, the goal of metal detectors is to keep students safe after the many recent school shootings that have taken place. Having metal detectors means you have more police officers in your school building. That does not make us feel safe. Instead, we feel like criminals because school safety officers are allowed to use deadly force and arrest us. I'm not going to jail, I'm going to school. And I should not have to be patted down to take off any of my accessories before entering a school building. And I should not be forced to go to school with police officers that eye my every move as if I'm a threat to society. If the goal of metal detectors and over-policing is to keep us safe, we should have more counselors. You should focus on our mental health rather than throwing police officers in our schools. Having more counselors means students have more people to talk to. Students who have problems in their personal lives or problems in schools have the opportunity to have someone they can trust. People who suffer from mental illnesses also are able to have people who know how to help them. This makes a way healthier and safe school environment than being policed all day.
Thank you, Alondra and Aiden. That was incredible. And actually your conversation at the end about counselors rather than police connects with the conversation in the beginning about mental health issues.